Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope everyone had a good holiday, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. And finally, I'm getting a moment here to get caught up and to shoot another video. And I apologize for there being a little time between this one and the last video. I actually shot a complete video on these speakers about a week or two before Christmas, and I had some issues with it. It was a long video. The battery died at the end. I got it going again. It died again. There was some files that were corrupt, and the whole ending on it was just so. I'm shooting a new ending on it to kind of wrap everything up, and this new intro for it. So, without further ado, let's get right into the video that I shot weeks before Christmas. Hey everybody, welcome back. Today I've got a video that I'm excited to share with you guys. I'm going to talk about my favorite speakers. Yep, no upgrades to this or that and stuff people are sent in. Today I get to talk about my stuff, my designs, my favorites. Before I get started though, I want to thank Nicholas over in Australia. I told you guys in the last video, Nicholas sent me a couple of t-shirts. This is the other one that he sent me. It's an awesome shirt. So I've got now two drag racing shirts from Australia. I'm going to stand up and let you guys see the print. It's a John Zappia shirt, and it's beautifully printed on the front and on the back. So it looks great, and I want to thank you, Nicholas, and all you customers out there who send me something cool. And if you do send me a cool t-shirt, you never know, I might wear it in a video. How about that? All right, let's get into my favorite speakers. Now, before I really start talking about the speakers you see here, I have to say my very favorites are the NX that you guys have seen in the background on several of the videos. That's usually what I have set up in here. It's my go-to two-channel favorite speakers of all time because they do everything. I mean, there's not a speaker on the market out there like it that's full open baffle, top to bottom, high sensitivity, and has servo controlled woofers and an open baffle and plays flat to 20 hertz and all that stuff. But those aren't for everybody, and they're not for every application. I also have a theater room that I've been putting together, and I've had just some of the early LGK models in there for now until I had a chance to build out what I wanted in there, and I'm finally getting the chance to build out what I want for my theater room and my living room, and then I'm building out another smaller theater system in my bedroom because we've got a big screen on the wall in the bedroom, and we're doing a small theater system in there with the new 2.0 LGK models, which I really love. But for my living room, my choice, my favorites, the X-Statics and the X-Voce center channel, and I'm going to tell you why they are my favorites. And first, let's just talk about how they sound, especially the X-Statics. The X-Statics are a hybrid style speaker, and I know you can't see all of it here. I'll try to figure out how to do some kind of B-roll or some photo shoots or something after I shoot the video, and maybe I can get some good photos of this that Ron can splice right into the video. I'll probably paste it right over me while I'm talking, and you can see how these things look. They're really cool looking. Upper baffle is an open baffle, so the mid bass drivers that you see here have this really open sound to them. It's an unboxed sound. Vocals tend to sound like they're more right there in the room with you and not playing at you from the speaker. It's just a different type of presentation. The woofers are in a sealed box that are down below. There's two of those below, and you'll see that in some photos. And they're in a sealed box because I'm looking for an earlier roll-off. I'm looking for tighter, more controlled bass. And then I'm wanting to use our servo-controlled woofers for the bottom end. For most customers, they may want to use the sealed servo subs, or they may want to use open baffle servo subs, which is what I'm going to use. I'm going to use dual 12-inch woofers on each side, so 4 12s in open baffle. And then the servo control system allows any kind of adjustments that I want. I can make those things do anything. And when you split that up, when you divide the low frequency and you pull it away from the main speaker and you dish that off to a sub, you gain tons of flexibility. Like you can go in and just, if you've got a peak in the room, you can take care of the peak, you can turn it down, you can adjust it, you can basically make it do anything. So that's why we separate those woofers from the main speakers, and I like doing that. And it's great for home theater, obviously, because there's a lot of stuff going on in home theater that's big bottom end explosions and things like that that you really don't want your main speakers having to cover. You don't want a lot of cone movement from your main drivers, because cone movement along excursions is long delay times, long settling times, it's not as fast, things like that. Whereas if you can pull that stuff off them and they're not going down that low, you gain a lot of flexibility. So for 2-channel, listening to especially female vocals, like it'll just put Eva Cassidy suspended in the room right there as if she's singing in my room. They have that kind of presentation. In home theater, they have the type of dynamics that when cannons go off and gunshots are going off and things are happening, they just rip that stuff off like it's really there. They've got those big dynamic swings from being a good sensitivity. They're about 90.5 dB sensitivity conservatively, and they'll do all those things. And same with the center channel, the matching center channel. It will have high levels of dynamics, but still create a very natural and very open sound. The whole midsection of this thing, as you can kind of see here, is open. So it tends to make the presentation of vocals and things sound like they're coming right out of the screen and not from down on the floor or something like that. And ideally you want this, fairly close to the screen. You want it right under the screen. And because this is open baffle, you want it out away from the wall a little bit. You don't want this thing crammed up against the wall. It's not going to work. This has to have some space. We're looking for about a 6 millisecond delay to that wall. So we ideally want this about 3 feet out from the wall. Some people don't quite have that. You can fudge it a little bit, especially if you put diffusion or absorption material on that wall right under your screen, or especially if you've got an acoustically transparent screen that you're dropping down, then you can put a lot of diffusion and stuff on the wall and absorption material, and you can really get great sound out of this as a center channel. So that's the stuff that just draws me to these things. And the other thing I want to mention too, as far as the application, is that anytime you have an MTM and you have it on its side like this, where you've got tweeter and you got mids on each side, anytime you get far enough off axis to where there's a sufficient delay in time to where this side is delayed versus the other side, you're going to get cancellation. And that's with any of these designs that are like that. So you have to keep in mind, is this for you in your application? Now, if you've got a theater system set up and you're 8 to 12 feet away and you've got a couch right in front of this thing that's centered on it, you can go to the far left or far right and it's not going to change the sound. You're hardly 10 degrees off axis when you move just that far over. You're just moving a seat over. If that's as wide as your seating is, these are perfect. If you're sitting all the way to one wall or all the way to the other, you're sitting in front of your left speaker, in front of your right speaker, or past that point where you're going to be more than 20 degrees off axis, this isn't the center channel for you. You'd need to go to something like our LGK model that has a single wideband driver that has great coverage in all directions. Anytime you go to one of these that has a coverage where it's more limited, you're going to have to keep in mind, is that good for your application? And sometimes it's really good for your application where you're in a room where it may be not treated as well as it should. And so that 2 to 3 kHz region, 1 kHz region, that's areas of brightness that if you have sidewall reflections, it can make things a little overbearing. This isn't going to have that there, because when you get that far off axis, there is a hole in the response. It's a dipped out area. So keep that in mind whenever you're looking at these particular models. Now, X-Statics and X-Voce, let me give you some background on this stuff. I originally designed these for AV123 way back. I think it's been 16 years or more since I designed these models. When it was brought to me, I was asked to do something a little higher end for this product line the product line that I had done, where I had XLS Encores, and we wound up doing an MTM center and an MTM floor standing version, and we just wanted to take it to another level. So I thought, well, to take this to another level, what would I do? I would put some of these drivers in an open baffle, because I really love the sound of open baffle. And so that's what I did with these, and they were big sellers for AB123. Now, way back then when I designed these, it was designed like a lot of other stuff where we're looking at anechoic measurements. We're looking at what is the response with a gated time window at 1 meter and at 50 to 60 inches away. And in those cases, these things measured great. Nice, smooth response. However, once you stuck them on the ground, the time differential from these, which are way up here, and the lower woofers, there was a floor reflection that was causing a little bit of cancellation. So right in the crossover point of like 160, 180, it was a little soft in that area because of the floor reflection. And I always thought, well, at some point when I get a chance to get a hold of another pair of these things, I'm going to re-examine that and see what I can do there, and maybe increase that level a little bit and fill that a little bit. And I've always had that in my mind that I wanted to do, but I haven't had a chance to get back on them. And for several reasons. One, I didn't have cabinets. And then finally, Killian made me these front baffles. He made me these hardwood baffles. And they've sat around in here for almost a year because we went through COVID and we couldn't get stuff. We couldn't get inductors, and we couldn't get more tweeters made. The material that was used in these tweeters became unobtainable, and the company making that material said we can't get it. And so it affected a lot of us. Sayaz used this same dome material in their top tweeters. So they couldn't get it. We couldn't get it. So there in India, they went to work trying to find suitable replacements, what would work. We found some material that was really close, but at the top end was a little dropped off. Then we went to working on the damping material behind it and the voice coil, and we lightened the voice coil by going to a little bit lighter gauge voice coil, and that brought the top end up a little bit. I guess, okay, you're looking at it this way. It brought the top end up a little bit and made a smooth response. It also played lower, and it also sounded a little bit better, which was a surprise. Weren't really counting on that, but that was good. So I wanted to wait until I had the tweeters that we're gonna have in stock, the new version, before going through and re-examining these things, because I didn't want to go in and make any changes or tweaks and then have to do it again because the tweeters are a little bit different. So waited till the new tweeters were here and then set these things up to re-examine everything. So that was kind of the process of what took so long to kind of get back on these. So that started with the X-Statics. I built out this pair, and I built them out with external crossovers so I could jack with it. And I do that a lot with my stuff, because then the crossover is easy to get to, and if I want to go in and try something later, I want to go in and try a different capacitor or a bypass cap or do some things that I can use it as a test bed. So I did it externally, and I set it up in here, and we took in-room measurements and compared that to on-axis measurements with a gated time window, and looked at references like the XLS Encore and measured that in-room versus looking at it with an anechoic measurement, or I should say with a gated time window. It's semi-anechoic measurement, and back and forth. And I designed a crossover for these that had a nice flat response, especially in-room, and I burned it in for a week, and I listened to it, and I made comparisons with it, and I just wasn't quite happy with it, because to me the top end was a little elevated. It was a little bright. I overcompensated for bringing that level back up a little higher, and because I also brought the low end up a little, I let these drivers overlap onto each other a little bit and feel some of that area where it had a little dip. And when it made that little bit of a soft area there, it was just a soft dip there, then it made it look like there was a peak at the bottom, where the bottom was the same level as the rest of it. It just had a little bit of a dip there. So that was gone. That was flat. That looked good, but it was a little bright still. So I went back in and re-examined it again, revoiced it a little bit, brought the tweeter level down, made more comparisons to reference stuff like the Encores again and other speakers, and burned it in and back and forth until I felt like I got it right where I wanted it. And I was looking at off-axis responses too versus the on-axis, and I'm really happy with these. They sound fantastic, especially when you blend it with the servo subs. Wow. Man, these things sound good. And so let's look at it. Let's look at some of the measurements that I took on these things. And let's look at the on-axis response first. And you'll notice it has a little bit of a smiley face kind of a look to it. That's to compensate for the floor reflection, where you see down at the bottom, it's elevated a little down at the bottom. Whereas when we put this thing down on the floor and take a measurement on it, that flattens back out because there's a little bit of cancellation going on. And that's with any speaker that has that type of configuration. A lot of three-way speakers and stuff where the woofer is up pretty high off the floor, you always kind of have to contend with that. It's always good to have that low frequency driver almost right on the floor. Then it couples with it the whole way and it doesn't have any kind of floor reflection. So that's why it's got a little bit of a smiley face look to it. And part of that also is for the off-axis response. So let's just jump to the horizontal off-axis, and you see a little bit of the opposite there. You see that it maintains the same output level all the way in the off-axis right there through that region, but at the top end and at the bottom end they start dropping off in the off-axis. So I mirrored that a little bit, and it helped a little with the overall in-room response. Let's look at the crossover response now, and you can see kind of where those things cross. The tweeters, the new tweeters are playing down, just like the old ones were. It's a look that's much like those that we had before. We're bypassing a couple of the resistors with small caps to bring the top back up a little bit, but overall that thing looks really good. Let's look at the vertical off-axis. Vertical off-axis is great. One, the acoustic centers between these are fairly close, and the crossover point is fairly low. So when you go up or down, the crossover region there is so low that it's filling the cancellation that you would normally get from woofers that are spaced this far apart. Normally if they're crossed at say 2500 hertz or higher, as you move up or down at those frequencies, this one is getting further away than the other, and they're starting to cancel each other out. Whereas in this case, it doesn't do that very much at all. It stays very consistent over a wide range. So great in-room response there. Looking at the impedance curve, nothing special going on there. It's a little high in the middle there because of the crossover that we're using. And it is a little bit low on the woofer end now. It goes down to about 4 ohms because we're overlapping these onto the lower woofers just a little bit to get that flatter in-room response. Also, let's look at the spectral decay. I always really like looking at spectral decays. It really shows the speed and resolution of a speaker. In this case, this thing looks really, really good. I'm really pleased with the spectral decay on this thing. Then let's look at some of the in-room response measurements. And the reason that we do in-room response measurements, and we do it almost on every speaker, is we're looking at how it rolls off and where the roll-off point is so that we can bring the servo subs right in and balance them and get a flat response with the servo subs. So the servo subs have tons of adjustments on the amplifier. And so we're making all those adjustments and looking at how the slope rolls into the speaker and how that slope is falling and what it's doing in our room. And then we're looking at different amplification. So if I go from, like, say, our chip amp to one of our dot audio tube amps, the input impedance is different, the output levels are different, and so the level of the output versus the amplifier for the servo subs can be completely different when you start changing amplifiers. So we have to go in and kind of make subwoofer settings for each amplifier that we commonly use. And so we'll take that in-room measurement and print that off, and then we'll take a picture of the settings on the subwoofer amp and put those two together so that we know when we swap those speakers in where to set the subwoofer amps so that it creates a flat response, so that we can demo this stuff and it can sound balanced. And so we're always making room response measurements and looking at this stuff. So the thing to keep in mind, though, in a room response measurement is it's not a measure of the speaker. It's a measure of the speaker in a specific room. And when you change placement locations, all of that changes. When you go to a different room, all of that changes. All the little peaks and dips all across the bottom are all going to be different in every room. What we're looking for, though, is we're looking for a nice smooth average. We don't want to see something going crazy, you know, and if you do, it could be a room related problem, and you need to address it with room acoustics, not digitally trying to EQ a peak out, because that does not fix it. If you've got a reflection at a certain frequency, the EQ just turns it down at that frequency. It doesn't change the fact that you still have a reflection there. So keep in mind, the best way to treat your up and down measure, you know, your response, if it's all over the place, is to set it up properly and do room treatment and try and smooth out the response and absorb areas that are peaks. And if you've got dipped areas, that could be cancellations. It could be a placement issue. So there's a lot to look at when you're doing an in-room response. So having said all that, let's look at one of the in-room responses that I took on this thing. And that's pretty smooth. I mean, if you're within 10 dB all the way across on an in-room response, that's usually pretty good. If you're within 5 dB or less, like this one is within 5 dB, man, that's great. And another thing I want to tell you about room responses, anytime you take a room response, you're going to get some gains and things in the lower frequency ranges. You're not going to get that up higher in the higher frequency ranges. As frequency is around, 200 to 300 hertz, they're completely omni. They're bouncing through that room. They're going front to back and forth, and they're doing all kinds of things. Below 1,000, you're going to get a little bit of more of an omni sound. Some of it's going to the back of the room. You're getting some gains from the room, and you're still getting some choppiness. With this size baffle, as you start getting above 1,000, the sound starts playing from the speaker forward. So you've got sidewall reflections, maybe 1K to 2K, maybe up to 3K a little bit. But then it starts doing this. It starts to beam a little bit, and you just hear what's coming from the speaker mostly and not so much from the room. So what happens is in the room response is the tweeter level, it just slowly drops off. Even though it may be flat in an on-axis frequency response, when you do an in-room response, that tweeter level is just going to roll right on off. It's going to be down. So this is typical. This is normal for almost any room. Now let's look at what I was able to do with it with the servo amp. Here it is with the little chip amp. You can see the settings, or you can see there where the subwoofer's crossing to it. Oh, it's down there around 50 hertz or so, right where it's crossing, and it's creating a flat response. And as you can see, even in the low bass, which is really difficult to do to get a smooth response in the low bass, it's still really smooth and really flat and goes flat out to 20 hertz. Here it is with the Dodd Audio chip amp. The settings on the servo amp have to be completely different in order to blend with it, but also, again, really smooth response. Amps change everything. You can go from one to another. And here's another illustration. This is a Dodd Audio tube amp. It's got 4 ohm and 8 ohm taps. I did one with the 4 ohm tap and one with the 8 ohm tap, and you can see a little difference in level of the 4 ohm versus the 8 ohm. And it can change with some speakers. It'll change the balance when you go from a 4 ohm to 8 ohm. If you have a speaker that's 4 ohms on one end and 8 or 10 ohms on the other end, that's an imbalance. And when you're using tube amps and you go from 4 ohm tap to 8 ohm tap, you're going to change the way that speaker sounds. You're going to change the tilt because the impedance is different on one end versus the other. Whereas one tap may be better for one top, it may be better for one end of the speaker, and then you go to the other tap and it leans more toward the other. It can be more bass heavy or more top end heavy. So when we design speakers, we look at the impedance curve over the whole range and try to make it balanced so that regardless of what amplifier you're using or which tap you're using, it's going to maintain a balanced response and not change with amplification. So there's all of that going on. Now, let's look at the X-Voce. The X-Voce, one of my favorites. Now, let's look at the on-axis response on this thing, and you can see it's flat. It's a smooth on-axis response. Looking at the crossover response, again, looks great. What you may notice with this, the lower woofers are crossing up a little bit higher to these woofers, and a lot of that has to do with the outputs that are in this configuration. It's the same drivers, it's just a different configuration, and it completely changes the response of these drivers by changing the configuration. You'll see that in a minute when we look at an in-room response. You'll notice that the in-room responses, when they overlay on each other, the little peaks and dips are all in different places, even though it's sitting in the same place in the room. Let's look at the vertical off-axis, and that's going up or down. Nothing changes. It keeps a wide range there. Now, remember when I told you about horizontal off-axis? Let's look at it. Look at the red line. That's on-axis. The orange line is 10 degrees off-axis. That would be the output level that you're going to get in a room when you're sitting one seat over on the couch. The yellow line is 20 degrees off-axis. So you've got pretty good coverage out to 20 degrees off-axis in each direction. You get past that, you're going to look at the green line and the blue line. You're going to see this stuff drop out. That's because you're so much closer to one side of the speaker than you are the other. That's just typical. Impedance curve. Impedance curve looks a little different. It actually drops close to 4 ohms way at the very top end. It's a little less balanced, but it is a center channel. So things are a little bit different on that. Spectral decay. Man, spectral decay looks good. Oh, man. I had one issue with this one, though. When Killian made this one for me, when he cut these baffles out of hardwood, he cut it so that the acoustic centers are a little close on these. Like these are supposed to be 11-inch acoustic centers. He made them 10.5. So these are overlapping onto the tweeter farther than they're supposed to. So it created 2 little humps right up there at the bottom of the tweeter's range. It created 2 little reflection points. Those are not there if this is moved out to 11 inches where it's supposed to be, and this is pulled back off of the tweeter a little bit. So mine's got those 2 little wiggles going on there. Not that big a deal. Let's look at the room response measurement on this thing. Room response measurement on this thing looks great. It's smooth all the way out. There's no dips or crazy things going on there. Let's overlay it with the X-Statik. So we're going to look at the X-Statik versus the X-Voce. They're in the same spot in the room. They're just taken one after another and overlaid on top of each other. The green line is the X-Statik and the red line is the X-Voce. And it's funny, you can see where one has a little bit of a peak, the other has a little bit of a dip, and where one has a little bit of a dip, the other has a little bit of a peak. Like I said with you guys earlier, that's all about room reflections. They're different for every speaker, for every application. You're going to see those little wiggles. Oh, another thing before I get off this, let's talk about these hardwood front baffles. Can you do hardwood? When can you do hardwood? When should you not do hardwood? So, hardwood is not a good material for speakers for several reasons. One, it can tend to shift and grow, and if it's not dried and solid, it can move around on you and warp and things like that. Another thing is it's very resonant. There's a lot more resonance to all hardwoods versus MDF, which is more like a glued up bag of sand. So using these on side panels, especially unbraced, is not a good idea. It'll resonate like crazy. It'll make noise. However, using them on a front baffle like this, especially when it's thick, and this is a pretty thick front baffle. We're talking 1 1/8 to 1 1/4 thick front baffle. It will not resonate because you're cutting the whole center sections out of this thing in order to make the front baffle. So basically you've got a hardwood frame. And when you've got just a frame, you're not dealing with a lot of resonance issues. Now the X-Statik has a little bit of space, about this much at the bottom, where there's a blank spot there, and we've put no res on that as well to help damp out any resonance the front panel may create. But it's thicker, and it's okay on a front baffle. And I love this what is this wood? Oh, walnut. This walnut that Killian found for me. He found a log, and it dried for quite a while, and till we knew it wasn't going to stretch or move, and made sure the wood was dried out. And then he made me these front baffles out of that walnut, and he also made me some end tables to set on each side of my love seat where my wife and I sit to watch TV and movies. And it's a live edge on the top of that walnut tabletop, cut from the same log. It looks beautiful. And so I wanted a dark wood in that room. And the walnut with the Duratex just looks fantastic. I love the walnut with the Duratex. It's just a great look. Dark, kind of a satin finish with this. Really pleased with it. So that's why we went with the hardwood stuff. All right, back to my living room setting here. And before I move on with the information about the kits, I want to say we've just recently set this stuff up and just wanted to get an idea of how it's going to work in the room. And there's nothing else been done in here yet. By that I mean we're always teaching everyone how to set this stuff up properly, what type of room treatment you need to use. You don't want a bare wall behind the speakers, all that sort of thing. We're not there yet on these. We just set them up. Next is going to be a line of diffusers along the back of the wall here below the TV to help break up the output from that wall. And then on each side, and these big spaces on each side of the TV, I'm going to be doing some large paintings on canvas that have foam panels inserted into the painting, into the frame, to help diffuse and help absorb sound and things like that. So that's coming, and yes, I actually do the painting. So that's a video for another day, so you can ask me about that another time. So all that's coming. And the TV, which is a big 82-inch flat screen, the video screen was just so reflective. Trying to shoot a video in here was almost impossible with all that reflection coming off that screen. So we just threw something over the screen just so we could shoot a video in here. So that's kind of what's going on there. I'm over here on one side, so you can just at least see the center channel and one of the speakers. So let's talk about the crossover stuff for these things. So with the X-Statik, there's a couple of options, and I mentioned earlier that I built these externally because I like to jack with them. You know, I may want to go in and change things and play with things and do stuff to it. So we've got little short connectors coming out with the male tube connector ends on it and the female tube connector input on one side. As you can see in here, this one would be the version that I'd sell with all the upgrades. That means it's got sonic caps in the tweeter circuit, and all the rest of the caps in the woofer circuit and part of the mid circuit, those are JB Poly caps, which are actually really good caps. All coils from US Coils and the new Dayton copper resistors. All that came out really, really well, and I'm really happy with how this thing sounds. Now, there'll be the version of this crossover, and you can mount that internally. You have to get a little crafty with where you mount it in here, but you can mount it internally. Or there will also be a version of this with just the JB Poly caps, and in the tweeter circuit there'll just be some JB bypass caps and some little point ones in the tweeter circuit to kind of give you guys a budget level version of it, but at the same time bump things up in quality just a little bit. So you can visit the page on the X-Statik, and you can see those options there when you order the kit. There'll also be options to where you can go and order a flat pack, or where you can order some finished cabinets. Now, onto the X-Voce. With the X-Voce, I wanted to do also a real budget version, and I've got a bunch of these crossovers left over that were what was left in inventory when AV123 went out of business. Now, when I designed these for these guys, I specified all polycaps, air core inductors, no sandcast resistors, and we put some sonic cap Gen 2 bypass caps on the tweeter circuit. So it had some pretty good parts. We did, however, use a laminated I-core inductor on the outer woofers because they're not playing up very high, and they did put an electrolytic capacitor as the shunt capacitor on the lower woofers, which you could kind of get away with because of where it is and because it's not playing up very high. It also was bypassed by a poly cap, so it wasn't pure electrolytic, but there was something going on there. Now, the electrolytic cap was a 100 volt rated cap, so not rated to handle a lot of power, and I don't really trust these so much. I'm not a big fan of electrolytic caps, and there may be issues with some of these that are out there. So I'm still going to throw in the crossovers as the budget level version of this thing, but we're replacing that electrolytic cap with a larger JB poly cap so that it's just got one capacitor in the path for that section. Also, we're going to offer a point-to-point wired crossover, and with the magic of video editing, maybe I can get Ron to show some video footage of the insides of this that you can't see from this angle, and see what the point-to-point wired crossover looks like with all the top-level parts. There's tube connectors that you can either mount right there at the crossover, or you can mount them on the back of the speaker, whatever you want to do. So we're going to do the budget level version with one of these crossovers, and we're going to offer a point-to-point wired crossover that is using all the best parts that we normally use, like I just showed you in the X-Statik. So there'll also be a flat pack that you can order for this thing, so you can put the cabinets together yourself. And there'll be some finished cabinets that you can order as well. All that'll be available on our site. You can check the prices and information there. The one version with the updated older AV123 crossovers, it's going to be pretty budget level price. I mean, I'm practically throwing that crossover in for free, plus the JB poly cap that I'm having to put on it. So I'm not allowing for much as far as the price on that. I'm just throwing it in. So that keeps the price of this pretty low. It's quite the bargain. Now, let's go back and talk about those AV123 models just a little bit. When these things were first released from AV123, the owner wanted to put some type of a grill on these things to protect them. And I hated the thought of putting a grill on these because I wanted these nice rounded edges on here so that the response is nice and smooth and doesn't have diffraction and things like that. And when you put a frame, a grill frame, right around the outside of the drivers, that diffraction really mucks up the response. So I wasn't real for it. So he came up with a solution. And the solution was a curved metal grill that went onto the surface of this. He even did some where he had some of the grills on the back. And he did the same with the center channel. Now the curved metal grills just stuck out from the drivers. And when I took a measurement of a few of them, they did not have diffraction issues. So in a way, it was a good solution. But also too, though, at some frequencies, there was still a little bit of a ring from that grill. So most of the people took the grills off. Now on the X-Voce, he wanted to cover this whole back section, the back panel and the top, with a grill as well. So use the same metal grill to cover that whole section there. Well, that's a big stretch metal grill with nothing supporting it, and that grill would resonate and it would ring. So most popular thing to do was to remove that, and it sounded much better. Now, one other thing that I'm going to comment on just briefly, because I feel like I just need to say something about it. There is a website out there that's called Audio Theory Review or something like that, where they just take measurements and they theorize a result based on measurements. And they got a hold of an older X-Voce model that was a production unit from AV123, the ones that were made in China actually. So it was first generation version that had the metal grill across the top and on the back and all that stuff. So that one that they got a hold of was wired improperly. It may or may not have had a capacitor failure on the board. Some of the measurements showed that there was some issues there with whatever was going on with that one that they had. And he also showed some stored energy or ringing at the top of the mid-ranges range, which he seemed to think that he fixed because he threw a towel over the top of it. And by throwing a towel over the top of it, he thought maybe it was something going on with the open baffle and that stuff doesn't really work and blah, blah, blah. What he really did was he just damped the ringing of the metal grill that was on the back, and all that effect that it had on the soundstage went away. And he said at that point it sounded really good. Well, that's great, but the solution isn't to put a towel over the top. If you've got one of those older models, just take the grill off, and that's your solution for that stuff. If you do own one of the older models, even an X-Statik, and you have any question about how it sounds, or you want us to take a look at it, update it, just send in one of the crossovers. We'll check it to see that everything's functioning properly on these older crossovers. We'll replace the electrolytic cap on there for free. As far as doing the labor, we'll swap all that stuff in and out. At the same time, if you want some of the caps upgraded, we could do that too. Just pay for the parts. Another big upgrade is to upgrade the connectors with tube connectors, new wiring. There's a lot of things that you can do to these things to bring these up another level. I'd also say, again, regarding those guys who got a hold of an X-Voce, you have to understand that there is a divide in the industry. There are the objective and subjective guys, and yes, we do everything by the book. I mean, we take measurements on everything, and we're looking at how things measure as the tools that we need while we're doing our design work. But we also focus a lot on what I call intangibles. That's imaging, image depth, soundstage layering, separation between instruments within the soundstage width, all the spatial cues and things that help make up the whole soundstage. Those are things that are almost impossible to measure, but they're clearly a part of the three-dimensional presentation that we strive so hard to recreate. Now, a lot of those guys over in that section over there, that side, they believe that if you can't measure any difference, then there shouldn't be any audible difference. Where we know, and we know that if there's an audible difference, but you don't see it in the measurements, then you're measuring the wrong thing. And we know that a lot of measurements are not going to capture all those differences that are created within the soundstage. And things that affect those are capacitors, different types of capacitors. The inductors can have an effect on that soundstage. The cables that you use in your system, speaker cables, power cables, interconnect, USB cables, the binding posts or tube connectors that you may have on the back, the internal wiring, bypass caps that you may have in the tweeter circuit. I mean, there's a ton of stuff that affect those areas, and we know that it affects those areas, and we do a lot of development with all of our speakers to try and take them to the highest level in those areas. We want to create a three-dimensional soundstage. We want layering. We want separation, and we want, when you drop one of our speakers into your system, you're just like many of our other customers that contact us and say, wow, I can't believe what a soundstage these things throw. And even some of the reviewers that get a hold of our stuff, even little encores, same thing. You know, those are what I call, again, intangibles, and we spend a lot of time focusing on those. And we spent a lot of time focusing on those with these speakers, especially the X-Statics, and they throw an incredibly just transparent soundstage you really have to hear, and you have to hear what the vocal presentation really is like in an open baffle to really get it. And these speakers, they're my favorites in this series because they bring those things to the table, and they do it in spades. It is my favorite in the X series product line, especially for home theater. And hang on, I'm going to get the rest of this system finished out. There's going to be some open baffle servo subs setting on each side of the center channel. We're going to do probably some tube traps in the corner. Don't tell my wife. And we're going to get this thing sounding fantastic. I'm excited to get to work on it. We're probably going to try out some different receivers and all that stuff. So stay tuned for that, and hopefully this year I'll have some good recommendations for you guys when it comes to AV receivers and stuff like that. That's it for this one. I appreciate you guys sticking around for this whole video, and thank you for being patient with us over the holidays to get a new video out. Please subscribe if you haven't. Hit that subscribe button, the bell notification button, and all that good stuff, and we'll see you guys in the next video.